Talk about the British invasion without analyzing the Beatles, who are probably responsible for most of what was going on at this time. Before I get into more of the musical elements of the Beatles, I'm going to talk a little bit about some background. In the seaport town of Liverpool, England, John Lennon, Paul McCartney, and George Harrison first teamed up as the Quarrymen in the late 1950s. A few name changes later, following stints as names such as Johnny and the Moondogs and the Silver Beatles, they they entered the '60s as the Beatles, with Ringo Starr as their drummer, and this was after firing drummer Pete Best and their original bassist Stuart Sutcliffe. In the late 1950s, the United Kingdom did not have much to offer musically. Much of what was being played in England at the time was very American influenced. It was not unique to the United Kingdom. But A Sign of Hope was one of the most promising music Britain offered was skiffle, which was an offshoot of New Orleans jazz, and this skiffle kind of originated in England, and this style of music eventually formed the British rock and roll sound. Okay, so the beginnings of Beatlemania. Um, so during the British invasion, there was a phenomenon known as Beatlemania, um, in which there was a craze that emerged in both the United Kingdom and in the United States, surrounding the stardom of the Beatles, and they'd attract massive audiences, and some popular images are screaming girls and whatnot, especially at events such as their performance at Shea Stadium in 1965, where people were getting carted off on stretchers, fainting at just the sight of them. Um, but again, some more background information for the beginnings of Beatlemania. The Beatles spent their early years really kind of commuting between Liverpool, England, and Hamburg, Germany. And at this time, the Beatles had kind of a proto-punk look. They were dressed in black leather and played in dives like the Kaiser Keller, the Star Club, and the Indra Club. Um, During this time, they learned to play loud, fast, and long in order to entertain the people at the bars. Um, and in Hamburg, the Beatles played over 800 hours in over 200 nights, which is pretty remarkable. Um, so by 1963, they already had two number one hits, "Please Please Me" and "From Me to You." Um, and you can't really talk much about the roots of the Beatles without going into the Cavern Club, which was a it was like a bar, a nightclub in London, and um, they performed their 282nd and final show at the Cavern Club on August 3rd, 1963. So again, this is a continuation of these long nights spent at clubs, entertaining basically drunk people at bars. So their fourth single, "She Loves You," was released a month after their final performance at the Cavern Club, and this became the best-selling single ever released in Britain um, at the time. Um, and another remarkable beginning performance by the Beatles was their appearance on October 13th, 1963, on a show known as Sunday Night at the London Palladium. They had a remarkable amount of viewers. 15 million Britons tuned in to watch them. So this was the official start to Beatlemania. Okay, so in early 1964, Beatles manager Brian Epstein decided that the Beatles needed to go to the USA. Flying in Pan American Flight 101, the Beatles arrived at JFK International Airport on February 7th, 1964, and they were soon greeted by thousands of people who just wanted to get a glimpse of them as they got off the plane. And it's interesting to note this quote by George Harrison. He said, "We heard that our records were selling well in America, but it wasn't until we stepped off the plane that we understood what was going on. Seeing thousands of kids there to meet us made us realize just how popular we were there." So it's kind of interesting to note that although the Beatles are very popular in England, that their fame in the United States just totally surpassed that, and they weren't even aware of that until they came here. Um, so I guess it's only appropriate to ask, why were the Beatles so popular in the United States at this time? And there are many theories to why this is, and some of the popular ones are that the assassination of JFK, of Martin Luther King Jr., the Vietnam War, and other violent events in the early 1960s kind of brought about a youthful idealism that children were able to connect with the music of the Beatles. Um, Another remarkable early performance by them was on February 9th, 1964. I shouldn't say performance, but more of just a big event. This is when the Beatles appeared on the Ed Sullivan Show in the United States, and they drew a crowd of an estimated 70 million viewers, which was at this time the most viewed event on television at this time period. Okay, so the height of Beatlemania continued. Um, so I Want to Hold Your Hand was released on November 29th, 1963, and this topped the singles charts for 7 consecutive weeks. Um, in March 1964, Meet the Beatles was released. I believe this was their second album after Please Please Me, and it was released under Capitol Records, an American record company, and 3.6 million copies were sold, making the largest selling LP in history. Um, so the first week of April 1964, the Beatles occupied 12 spots on the Billboard 100 and every position in the top 5, totally knocking out all American bands at this time. This was the height of Beatlemania and the British invasion, because no Americans were at the top spots. All British bands, namely the Beatles, were on the top. And the songs in order were "Can't Buy Me Love," "Twist and Shout," "She Loves You," "I Want to Hold Your Hand," and "Please Please Me." Those were the top 5 on the Billboard 100. In addition to their musical success, the Beatles also had success in the merchandising field. Their first movie, A Hard Day's Night, was released in 1964, and the Beatles were also featured on lunchboxes, inflatable dolls, and this accounted for an estimated $50 million in retail business in 1964 alone. So the Beatles had become Britain's leading cultural export, and the trail they blazed to the colonies quickly became a well-trampled one. So, which means that soon to follow the Beatles were many other British bands, which will be talked about later in this presentation. Okay, so after the release of Rubber Soul in 1965 and Revolver in 1966, the Beatles moved into another phase. Now, Rubber Soul and Revolver, Rubber Soul saw the beginning of kind of the Beatles' trippy psychedelic phase, with namely with the song Norwegian Wood, George Harrison playing the sitar. They were experimenting with a lot of new stuff at this time. Revolver was the ultimate trippy album, a lot of acid influences. So at this time, the Beatles kind of transformed into a group of mob tops and into more of the poet, I guess, laureates of the day, particularly George Harrison, and they looked for something more than just the fame that they received during their initial time in America. So now on to more of the musical aspects of some of the Beatlemania, more British invasion kind of music. So their debut album was Please Please Me. It was released in 1963. and it was rush released on March 22nd, 1963 in the United Kingdom because two singles, Please Please Me, hit number one on the charts, and Love Me Do hit number 17. So the Beatles wanted to, I guess, commercialize on the success financially by releasing a new album. So the album featured 14 songs total, 8 written by Lennon and McCartney. Now, for this time, 8 out of 14 songs in an album written by the artists themselves was pretty remarkable because at this time a lot of what was going on was covers and remixing earlier songs that were already written by other artists, and in light of that, this was the beginning of what Rolling Stone would call the idea of a self-contained rock band writing their own hits and playing their own instruments. So the Beatles were kind of early proponents of that, and I guess that kind of made its way into decades after that. Another thing to note about these early songs, especially in albums like Please Please Me, that the songs always use I and the girl is always you, and this allows for the listener to kind of get into the song and be a part of that, which is another reason why their songs were so popular among the young at this time. Okay, so Please Please Me is the album, but there's also a song called Please Please Me. It's the 7th track on the album, and John Lennon is quoted as saying that this is his attempt at writing a Roy Orbison kind of style song, and I'm sure you've listened to Roy Orbison before. His songs are usually slow and very bluesy, but George Martin, when Lennon wrote this song, it was very similar to a Roy Orbison song. It was slow, bluesy, kind of boring, and George Martin, their record producer in England, who ended up having a lot of influence on the Beatles' work throughout their entire career, he recommended a faster tempo and call and response lyrics, which the Beatles ended up doing, and that's the main reason why the song was a hit. The youth liked the fast tempo. Another element to the song is Lennon on harmonica, probably him trying to copy Bob Dylan or something along those lines. And McCartney and Lennon share the vocals in this song, with McCartney holding a high note as Lennon drops through the scale. Now this is very interesting effect, and it was something that was really new to this time. But the Beatles did copy it from the Everly Brothers' "Kathy's Clown," which is an earlier song, I think written in 1962. But the Beatles used that technique and popularized it in this recording of Please Please Me. Now another song that I kind of want to look at a little bit is "Can't Buy Me Love," which was released in 1964, in March of 1964, and okay, so it's the 7th track on "A Hard Day's Night," another very popular Beatles album, and it rose to number 1 in 2 weeks. So it was a big hit early on, and what's structurally notable is that it's in a 12-bar blues structure, which we looked at throughout the semester, beginning in the early 1900s, and I guess continuing into the music of Eric Clapton and here in the case of the Beatles. Now in songs like Please Please Me, which I just kind of I looked at, the Beatles had very typical background vocal harmonies, usually George and Paul, or George and John on background, while there was a lead singer and more of a call and response. But this was the first Beatles song released without this typical background vocal harmony. So that's remarkable, and it still reached number 1 without that. So the Beatles were I guess this was the beginning to a change in the Beatles' musical style, which would be expanded more in 1965 with the release of Rubber Soul. But this is an early example of them changing up a little bit of what they were doing in their recordings. Now, again, "Can't Buy Me Love," it was the 3rd consecutive Beatles single to reach number 1, breaking a record set by Elvis Presley. So very impressive. Elvis Presley, of course, very popular in America during the 1950s, and now the Beatles breaking their record shows that English rock was starting to take over.